Nate, why don't we talk about SSH server side things?
We've been talking about key-based authentication and password-based authentication. There's a couple things I like to do to the SSH daemon, which helps improve the security of your RHEL system. And I think some of these have actually become defaults in RHEL 9. I'd have to go look at a base deployment of RHEL 9 again to be certain. But let me jump back into my terminal and we can look at the SSH configuration on my system. So if we go vim etc sshd hd underscore config. Now there's also an SSH client config that lives here where you can configure stuff on the SSH client. We're not going to touch that today, but just know it's there if there's any client side stuff you want to configure. This is the SSH server configuration. And you'll notice we're already at the line where it says password authentication, yes. Now this is on my machine around line number 65. I don't know if that's going to be the same on a base RHEL deployment because I know we changed some of these configurations on these labs when we deploy them. You can see currently it says password authentication, yes. Now, when I'm in a case where I'm managing servers and I control the deployment of the servers, I will pre-populate my administrative users and their SSH keys. If you're in a centrally managed user domain, you can populate those keys and access at that level. Normally, what I would do is out of the box, I turn password authentication off. Now, let me show you how that works. Well, here, you've seen key authentication work, so I'm not even going to bother setting that up. I'm going to go and turn password authentication to no. And reload the SSH daemon. Only if you don't misspell reload. Now, the cool thing is when you reload that daemon or restart that daemon, existing sessions don't die. One day I was managing a remote server. I had to make a change. I didn't think about it. I just reloaded SSH. And right as I hit enter, I panicked. And then it came right back. It never dropped me. I thought that was amazing. It doesn't kill connections when it reloads. So now I'm back on the client. Remember before we were able to SSH in and type a password. I haven't set a key up, and I don't think there's one out of the box. So if I SSH to RHEL, it should reject me. It doesn't even say, hey, what's your password? Or can you help me out here? No, it's just no. You cannot do that. If I go in as root, and this will make sense in a moment when I show you my next task, there's already a key exchanged for root, right? Here I am as root at RHEL, where I was root on client 1, because there's already a key set up. So that shows you, yes, key authentication is still working. Password authentication is turned off. The reason I like to do that is go to your favorite cloud provider, spin up a new instance, and watch the logs. Within possibly seconds, usually minutes, maybe hours, you'll start seeing brute force attacks against the EC2 user or the cloud user is for that particular cloud. People trying to guess the password. If you turn off password authentication, those will still happen. They'll still try, but they won't get anywhere because SSHD is literally saying, no, I don't take passwords. You cannot brute force an account because you can't give it a password, right? The other thing I like to do in a similar, for similar reasons, is I tell SSHD that the root account is not allowed to be connected with. So you see permit root login is right here, and it's set to yes. You saw I connected as root just a minute ago, but if we set it to no and reload SSHD, go back to my client. If I try to connect as root at RHEL now, it should reject me, but it didn't. Why didn't it? See, I didn't test this because I assumed it was going to work. Sometimes it's in the SSHD config more than once if you use automation to configure it. So let's try again. Ah, there it is. It's there twice. That's whoever made these systems, Scott, terrible administration. Let me check if it's there a third time. No, it's not. So let's reload it again. And this time it should not let me connect as root. All right. I'm root at client 1. I'm going to SSH to root at RHEL. And there you go. Permission denied. No, I don't care. I've got your key. I'm not asking for a password because I was told not to, but I'm still not going to let you in because you're root and I've been told root can't connect. Why would I do that? 1, because you shouldn't be SSHing to your systems as root. Bad admin. And 2, because the bad guys are going to try to SSH to your system as root, because every Linux system on the freaking planet has a root account. So that's their first attack vector is, can I get into root? Because if I can get into root, because if someone said a bad password for root and I get into root, I've got your system, right? So I just say, no, you can't connect to root. Root's mine. In fact, root's not even mine. I use sudo for everything. Root is like super protected, off in a corner, break glass if you need this account. Okay, I'll get off my soapbox now.
Not allowing password-based SSHs is the default for RHEL 9. So key-based authentication is the default. Allowing root or not is an install time question. The
Right.
default is root will not be able to authenticate. And when you're going through the installer, there's a little checkbox that says, would you like to enable root access
Right.
to the machine? And if you check the box, you're saying permit root yes in your SSH configuration. If you don't make any changes, the default will be that root is not allowed to log into the system. For RHEL
Right.
9 and later.
Yep. Yep.
All right. I have my own preference of SSHD changes. Let's throw in my system and go to etc sshd ssh sshd config. I like changing ports. Everyone knows the default port for SSH is port 22. Oh, and you have to add it to your SE Linux config.
While Scott's looking at that, I'll throw in a bit of commentary. This is a way to effectively hide SSH from attackers. So that use case where I told you about, where you spin up a new cloud instance and within seconds people are starting to brute force SSH, this will at least temporarily limit or block that. So if you've got people blindly trying to connect to port 22 and they don't have any intelligence at all in their attacks, they won't be able to find your SSH daemon because you've moved it to a new port. Now, I say temporarily because a simple port scan with any sort of intelligence behind it will be able to find SSH. So unless you're doing something, I've heard of like crazy situations where they set up what's called knock ports, where you connect to a series of ports and then SSH opens. That I've never been able to configure it, but it sounds amazing.
Knocking.
Yeah, port knocking. It sounds like a really cool way to hide SSH in a way that people are not going to be able to get to it. But if you're not going to go that far off the deep end, simply moving it to a new port can be a certain layer of security. Security
Okay.
by security. I see Rick saying in the chat. Yes, that's exactly what this is. It's like the checkbox in MS SQL Server that says hide SQL Server adds 1,000 to the port. People know where it moves. It just makes them slow down for half a second.
Well, Nate, you were just talking about how when you start a machine fresh, you'll notice in the
Yeah.
log are like thousands upon thousands every day of people trying to brute force SSH attack your machine.
Right.
Do that is they just run scripts that SSH to your
Yeah.
machine.
Most of those are automated things. There's no person behind that. Well, there's a person behind it, but there's nobody controlling it. It's just like things that run that are en masse, always checking port 22. If you moved it to port 23, well, that's Telnet. Don't put it on 23 because 23 is also getting hit. But if you moved it to something obscure, those scripts will never find SSH because nobody's thinking to look elsewhere.
You mean like port 8122?
There you go, like port 8122.
Yeah. So that's why it's like you can just refuse all traffic because they'll be connecting to a closed port and you'll cut off brute force attacks if you move your SSH to another port number. The flip side is one, you saw that I had to add the SSH port T type to this new target port. So SE Linux will allow the SSH daemon to bind to this non-standard port. The other thing is on the client side, you also have to make a couple changes. So over here on my client, if I want to SSH now, I need to tell it that I need to code to port 8122.
The syntax you might be used to, where you add a colon to the end of the host name, does not work with the SSH client. You have to do that -p8122.
Right. But the other thing that I use to make this a non-issue.
Yeah, that could work as long as all your systems are running on that port. Set up a bash alias. Yeah.
I didn't want to be brute force attacked all the time.
I did it everywhere.
Right. If you've not seen an alias before, it's a bash feature that says when I run this command, SSH, really run the command SSH-P 8022. And so all the arguments you would pass to SSH pass through on your alias as well, so that when I use my alias SSH, it runs SSH with additional arguments and whatever else I pass in the command line. But as Nate pointed out, like you need to make this, if you want to make this change, you kind of commit to making this change everywhere. And when you don't, you then have to use P to say P20 to go somewhere new.
I think there's
Or
a bash shortcut that'll say execute this command without the alias. It's like a backtick,
it's backslash.
backslash. That's what it is. There you go.
Yeah.
There.
It looks like, right? Backslash in the name says ignore any alias for this,
Yes.
run it natively. My machine is bound on port 8122. When I try to connect to port 22, it errors out. So my favorite change is binding to a non-standard port.
Rick mentions that you can do this in the SSH client config. You can remember the client config I was talking about earlier when I was talking about the SSHD config. There's an SSH config inside of Etsy. If you set all your clients to set the SSH port to 8122, that'll do the same thing. Thank you, Rick.
Oh, so Nate, we want to talk about common problems we see.
Yeah, there's some common errors that you can run into with SSH when you're trying to connect to a remote system, even if things are working properly. We talked about that earlier, and I don't know, Scott, if you had cooked up, we had talked about if you could maybe make a demo of this. One of them would be if that host key changes on the server. Is that what you're trying to get ready?
That's what I was trying to get ready, and I think I did it. We'll see.
Hey.
Whoops.
Oh, see that command line alias you set up is hurt. There you go. Look at how terrible that error looks. Warning, the remote host identification has changed. It's possible someone is doing something nasty.
What it's telling us is when we try to do that key-based validation of the remote host,
Right.
that the key that it's presenting to us doesn't match the key that we have stored in our known hosts file. So down here in SSH, the last time we connected to that host, it put it.
The cool thing before you do that, it'll tell you offending ECDSA key is in known hosts :3. That means it's on line 3. So
Yeah,
if you're trying to figure out what keys it caring about, because you might have 100 keys in there, it tells you which line it is. There's a command line shortcut to Vim that'll skip to that key with the number 3. It goes to that line.
I use :3 inside VI.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, yeah, that's another way to do it. But before you just delete that key, make sure you validated that this key has changed for a valid reason before you just accept that and move on. There's a reason SSH defaults to not letting you connect to it.
Right. This is common in places that use DHCP
Yeah.
because machines may reuse someone else's DHCP address that you had connected to previously. When you try to connect to that IP, it doesn't have the same host key because it's moved on the network.
Yep.
It could be
Or if a machine was retired and months later you're building a new machine that shares the IP with that old machine, your client config doesn't update when that old machine was removed, even if you were as studious as possible in cleaning up all the DNS entries and whatever, right? If you connect by IP address, there'll be an entry for the IP address, and it'll say that's not the key I remember at this IP address.
Man, we have a lot of host keys for this machine.
Oh yeah, there's actually several ways that it'll store that in there. That it'll do it by the name, by the IP address, and there was a third one you just had to clear out.
All right. So once I have all the references to this machine removed from the known host file and connect back, it's like the first time I've ever connected this host again. So it's asking me if I want to import the credentials or the keys for this host. Right. So that works. And then when I come back over here, there are the fingerprint ID and key ID for the host. 3 different types of keys, 3 different encryption.
There was a question in chat. If you're the admin, where do you see that failure in the logs to assist the user with why they can't connect to the server. The error is shown on the client, or that error is shown on the client computer. The error is obvious on the client end. If a user contacts you and says, I'm getting this error, now you know what that error is, you know how to troubleshoot it. On the server side, it's in the secure log. So
No,
you
the server side won't error because it's starting its key exchange like it would for every connection. It,
errors like these will sometimes be in the secure log. That was the end of my sentence. But I do not believe this one will show up in the secure log because your client is refusing the connection, not the server. The server didn't say you're invalid. The client said, no, that's the wrong key, and it'll drop.
Another common one I see is someone SSHing somewhere.
But you have the wrong broken.
I removed the known hosts for my root user, but not removed the known hosts for my regular person. All right, let's try this one more time. Yes.
This is a common one.
Yeah. This is why earlier in the episode I used SSH copy ID when I was taking that public key and moving it around to the target host I wanted to use. If you use copy or SCP, it'll often put the file in place like you expect, but it gets the default file permissions, which are like 664 or 644. And
Right.
for your private key and for your authorized keys file on the remote machine, what we really want in .sh, this file needs to be permissioned 600. Right, so that was what it was complaining about with that gnarly looking error message, was that I had the wrong permissions on that file. And now that I fixed it, when I go and connect to the remote machine again, it works fine. The other place where that's important, notice on the remote machine, this authorized keys is also permissioned 600. And so for some reason it was 644 or 664, it would also give you an error about not having the right permissions.
Right.
I've also seen more recently people complaining that their key-based authentication is broken. They can SSH to RHEL 7 machines, but they can't SSH to RHEL 8 machines or RHEL 9 machines. And likely the cause there is your SSH key is the wrong algorithm. So on RHEL 8 and 9, we create RSA keys by default. A bajillion years ago, when you did an SSH keygen, it would create a DSA key by default. On RHEL 8 and 9, DSA keys are no longer acceptable for key-based authentication. And so if you've taken your RHEL 7 generated DSA key and you put it on your RHEL 8 machine or your RHEL 9 machine, it won't help you because RHEL 8 and 9 don't accept that algorithm or cipher for keys. So
Right.
you'll need to regenerate your key as an RSA key to then continue to use it.